There is a quiet shift underway inside the American system. Not the kind that announces itself through speeches, executive orders, or breaking news banners, but the kind that appears first in tone, in how institutions speak more carefully, how agencies narrow their language, how legal filings become more technical, and how federal authority begins to sound less assured, even when it is stated forcefully. In Washington, moments like this are rarely dramatic. They are subtle. They show up in postponed decisions, in regulatory guidance that avoids definitive conclusions, in court documents that emphasize procedure over substance. Veteran observers notice it in the margins, in footnotes that seem unusually cautious, in timelines that quietly stretch, in official statements that answer fewer questions than they once did. This is how institutional stress announces itself. Over the past weeks, federal agencies have increasingly emphasized process, jurisdiction, and mandate, often avoiding broader justifications. Courts faced with politically sensitive disputes have leaned into narrow procedural reasoning. Financial markets, reacting not to rhetoric but to uncertainty, have shown signs of hesitation. Brief pullbacks, volatility spikes, and a growing sensitivity to political signals that previously would have been dismissed as noise. None of this is accidental, and none of it is loud. That is the atmosphere surrounding the United States right now. Public attention, meanwhile, is drawn elsewhere, to large-scale protests unfolding across multiple American cities. Demonstrations have filled streets from the West Coast to the Midwest to the East Coast, with demands ranging from immigration enforcement reform to accountability at the highest levels of government. These scenes are visually powerful. They dominate social media feeds, cable news panels, and political debate. They feel like the story, but they are not the whole story. Behind that visibility is something quieter and far more consequential. Institutions are responding, not to the protests themselves, but to what the protests signal about legitimacy, trust, and systemic pressure. Federal systems are not reacting emotionally. They are not engaging rhetorically. They are recalibrating how authority is exercised, recalibrating how enforcement is justified, recalibrating how risk is managed in an environment where public confidence appears increasingly fragmented. This is not a system in panic. It is a system under strain, adjusting its posture. And historically, this is the moment that matters most. The moment when institutions begin conserving credibility, tightening procedure, and preparing for uncertainty, long before the public narrative fully catches up. This is where public narrative and institutional reality begin to diverge. In the public arena, the moment is framed almost entirely as political conflict, supporters versus opponents, streets versus authority, rallies, counter-rallies, viral clips, and slogans competing for attention in an accelerated media cycle. Within this framing, protests are treated primarily as emotional expression, and government responses are interpreted as tactical messaging, designed either to reassure a political base or to project strength. That framing is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete. Inside institutions, the conversation looks very different. Federal agencies are not debating whether the protests are morally justified or politically persuasive. They are assessing something far more consequential: whether institutional legitimacy is being stretched, and how enforcement actions will be interpreted months or years from now, not just in the next news cycle. This distinction matters. In recent weeks, agencies across the federal government have increasingly emphasized jurisdictional limits, statutory authority, and procedural compliance in their public communications. Language has narrowed. Statements have become more technical. This is not a messaging choice. It is a signal of institutional caution. Courts, meanwhile, are not weighing ideology. They are weighing durability. Judges are asking whether precedents can withstand sustained political pressure, whether emergency actions meet established thresholds, and whether procedural shortcuts taken during moments of unrest will later undermine the legitimacy of rulings themselves. In politically sensitive cases, rulings have leaned heavily on process, timing, and standing, classic indicators of a judiciary protecting its institutional role. Financial actors interpret the moment through yet another lens. Markets are not responding to protest signs or political speeches. They are responding to uncertainty around governance, regulatory independence, and information credibility. When executive rhetoric escalates or institutional disputes intensify, markets adjust quietly, through volatility, hedging behavior, and cautious capital movement. This is not ideological judgment, it is risk management. What this actually reveals is a system responding to signals, not headlines. The public sees conflict. Institutions see stress indicators. They see rising friction between enforcement authority and civil legitimacy. They see increasing pressure on information channels, from journalism to official data. They see political narratives moving faster than institutional capacity to absorb them. And when multiple systems, legal, administrative, financial, begin reacting at the same time, analysts interpret it not as routine turbulence, but as a structural test. This is the point at which systems start preparing for scenarios they hope never materialize. Not collapse, but strain. Not breakdown, but prolonged uncertainty. The public conversation may still revolve around who is winning the political argument. Inside institutions, the question is different. Can the system continue to function predictably under this level of pressure? And if not, what must be adjusted to preserve continuity? That is the signal beneath the noise. The protests themselves are not the core issue. Protest movements are a recurring feature of American history. They emerge during moments of social tension, political transition, and institutional disagreement. On their own, they do not signal systemic rupture. What makes this moment distinct is the institutional environment in which these protests are unfolding. They are taking place amid increasingly visible disputes over the boundaries of executive authority, not only in rhetoric, but in operational practice. Questions that were once confined to legal scholarship and internal memos are now surfacing in public view. How far executive discretion extends, how enforcement priorities are set, and how much independence federal agencies retain when political pressure intensifies. Immigration policy has become one of the central fault lines in this debate. Enforcement actions, the deployment of federal resources, and the interaction between local jurisdictions and federal authority have drawn sustained scrutiny. These are not new disagreements, but they are now unfolding at a moment when institutional trust is already under strain, amplifying their impact. At the same time, attention has turned toward how the Department of Justice operates under pressure. Legal observers have noted heightened sensitivity around prosecutorial discretion, transparency, and the sequencing of public disclosures. In politically charged cases, even routine DOJ decisions are now interpreted through a lens of institutional credibility rather than legal outcome alone. This scrutiny extends beyond law enforcement. Regulatory agencies responsible for economic data and market oversight are operating in an environment where confidence in official information has become a subject of political debate. Inflation figures, employment data, and market indicators, once treated as largely technocratic outputs, are now contested in the public arena. For institutions, this changes the stakes. Accuracy is no longer sufficient. Legitimacy must also be defended. Parallel to this is the evolving relationship between the executive branch and the press. Public confrontations, challenges to journalistic credibility, and disputes over access and coverage have introduced additional friction into an already stressed information ecosystem. From an institutional standpoint, this is not about individual reporters or outlets. It is about whether established channels for public accountability continue to function predictably. Seen individually, none of these developments are unprecedented. Seen together, they form a convergence. From an institutional perspective, this convergence matters more than any single protest sign, chant, or speech. Systems are not destabilized by dissent alone. They become vulnerable when legal authority, economic confidence, and information credibility are all under simultaneous pressure. This is the trigger analysts pay attention to. Not a moment of outrage, but a moment of overlap. When disputes that normally unfold sequentially instead collide in real time. When courts, agencies, markets, and the public sphere are all responding at once, even if quietly. History shows that systems are most exposed not when they face opposition, but when multiple stressors accumulate faster than institutions can compartmentalize them. That is why this moment is being interpreted inside the system, not as routine political turbulence, but as an inflection point that requires careful management. Publicly, attention has focused on demonstrations opposing immigration enforcement practices and criticizing the use of federal authority against journalists and activists. These events have been widely reported, intensely debated, and sharply polarized. Images of protests, arrests, and confrontations have come to define the public-facing narrative of the moment. Inside institutions, however, the trigger has been understood in broader terms. What has drawn sustained internal attention is not the protest activity itself, but the perception that several forms of power, enforcement authority, information control, and executive messaging, are increasingly converging rather than operating in clearly separated lanes. This convergence alters how institutions behave. When law enforcement actions intersect with press activity, agencies immediately shift into risk management mode. Decisions that might once have been treated as routine enforcement questions are now evaluated through legal, reputational, and constitutional lenses simultaneously. Internal reviews become more layered. Documentation becomes more meticulous. Approval chains lengthen. This is not hesitation. It is institutional self-protection. Federal law enforcement bodies, particularly those operating in politically sensitive domains, have shown growing emphasis on procedural justification, warrants, jurisdictional clarity, and strict adherence to statutory language. This trend has been widely observed in recent reporting on how agencies frame their actions, often highlighting legal authority rather than operational outcomes. The Department of Justice occupies a particularly delicate position in this environment. As public scrutiny intensifies, even standard prosecutorial decisions are interpreted as signals of institutional independence or vulnerability. In response, DOJ communication has increasingly leaned toward formalism, emphasizing process, precedent, and legal thresholds rather than narrative explanation. This reflects an internal priority: preserving the department's credibility as an institution distinct from day-to-day political conflict. Federal courts respond differently, but no less strategically. Judicial reactions are rarely immediate, yet patterns emerge. Judges faced with politically charged cases often narrow the scope of rulings, focusing on standing, jurisdiction, or procedural compliance rather than sweeping constitutional declarations. This approach has been noted across multiple high-profile disputes in recent years. It is a classic judicial strategy during periods of institutional tension. Protect the court's legitimacy by limiting exposure. Congressional response has been uneven, reflecting its fragmented incentives. Oversight mechanisms activate selectively. Committees signal interest, request briefings, or issue statements, but coordination remains limited. This is not simply gridlock. It is a reflection of competing institutional calculations about timing, jurisdiction, and political cost. Behind the scenes, congressional staff and oversight professionals focus less on spectacle and more on record building, preserving documentation, tracking agency compliance, and maintaining leverage for future action. Again, this is defensive behavior. Financial institutions and markets add another layer to this reaction. While protests dominate headlines, markets quietly monitor governance signals. Periods of heightened institutional friction have coincided with increased volatility, cautious investor behavior, and sensitivity to executive statements affecting regulatory independence or economic data credibility. Markets do not take sides. They hedge against uncertainty. Across all of these systems, a common pattern emerges. Institutions are not escalating, they are insulating. This is where analysts begin to use a different vocabulary. Internal discussions shift away from near-term policy wins and toward longer-term concepts: continuity of operations, institutional resilience, reputational containment, and legal durability. The focus becomes less about advancing authority and more about preserving it. That shift is subtle. It rarely makes headlines, but it is decisive. Historically, when American institutions enter this defensive posture, it signals recognition that the environment has changed, that the usual assumptions about legitimacy, trust, and compliance can no longer be taken for granted. The system is still functioning, but it is no longer operating on autopilot, and that distinction matters more than any single confrontation on the street. Inside the executive branch, responses have emphasized authority and control. Official statements reinforce legality, mandate, and enforcement discretion. This is standard during periods of unrest. But what is less visible is how agencies internally manage the reputational and legal exposure that accompanies such assertions. Enforcement bodies begin documenting decisions more carefully. Communication offices tighten approval processes. Legal counsel becomes more prominent in operational discussions. Congress, meanwhile, shows signs of fragmentation rather than coordination. Oversight mechanisms activate unevenly. Hearings are discussed but delayed. Subpoenas are debated but not always issued. This is not paralysis. It is risk calculation. Federal courts operate on a different timeline, but signals appear there as well. Judges ask narrower questions. Rulings rely more heavily on procedural grounds. This is not ideological caution. It is institutional self-preservation. Financial institutions and markets respond in their own language. Volatility increases. Investors seek signals of predictability. When executive actions introduce uncertainty around regulatory independence or economic data credibility, markets do not argue. They adjust. Behind closed doors in Washington, none of this is framed as a crisis. It is framed as a management problem. Democratic norms rely not just on law, but on shared acceptance of authority. When trust erodes, enforcement becomes harder, governance becomes slower, and policy outcomes become less predictable. Domestically, prolonged institutional strain can lead to administrative inefficiency, legal backlogs, and reduced compliance. Economically, uncertainty affects investment decisions and consumer confidence. Internationally, allies watch closely, not for moral judgment, but for signals of reliability. American power has always rested as much on institutional credibility as on military or economic strength. When internal coherence weakens, global influence follows. The United States has faced periods of institutional stress before, during the Vietnam era, during Watergate, during the post-9/11 expansion of executive power, and during financial crises that exposed regulatory failures. Each time, the system adapted, sometimes through reform, sometimes through retrenchment, always through tension. What distinguishes the current period is the simultaneity of pressures, legal, informational, economic, and social, all interacting in real time within a hyper-connected public sphere. This is not a collapse, it is a transition. Transitions are rarely comfortable. They are defined by uncertainty, by contested authority, and by institutions renegotiating their roles. The question is not whether the system survives. Historically, it does. The question is what shape it takes afterward. In moments like this, power does not disappear. It redistributes. It flows toward institutions that retain credibility, predictability, and legitimacy. Understanding that process matters more than reacting to any single headline. Because the real story is not the protest itself, nor the statement that follows it. The real story is how the system responds when its assumptions are tested. What does it mean for a democracy when institutions begin acting defensively rather than expansively? And how does power change when legitimacy becomes the most valuable currency inside the system? If you found this analysis useful, leave your thoughts in the comments and consider subscribing to US Power Report. In our next episode, we'll examine how internal institutional stress in the United States is reshaping its strategic posture abroad, often in ways the public never sees. Until then, stay focused on the system, not the spectacle.